Let me welcome you. Sorry, it's a little loud. It's an empty room. So if you'd like to come closer, don't be shy. But I'd like to begin. My name is Richard Leventhal. I'm from the University of Pennsylvania and from the Penn Cultural Heritage Center. Today we will be talking about the destruction of cultural heritage and warfare and some of the work that people are doing both in Syria and Iraq, but in other parts of the world, including Mexico. My job right now is really to just introduce, to give you a sense of the schedule and introduce our first speaker. But the schedule will be for each of us to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes about our work and what we're trying to do in terms of study and the nature of the destruction of cultural heritage and warfare. And then we'd like to open it up for a roundtable discussion. So that will include the audience, as sparse as you are. So please don't be shy when we get to the questions, and we'll bring people up here. We may even come down here and sit at the edge of the proscenium rather than sit up here in a very formal way. But let me introduce Brian Daniels, who will kick off our presentations and conversation.
Thank you, Richard. My name is Brian Daniels. I'm the Director of Research and Programs at the Penn Cultural Heritage Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's conversation. And I think that with the audience as it is, this is going to very much be a conversation, and the formality here feels a little bit odd and awkward. But please bear with us because we really do want this to emerge into a dialogue, a conversation that extends the kind of conversations that we've been having over the past couple of years at the University of Pennsylvania, but also in other venues like this. It doesn't come, I think, as a surprise to anyone who is here today that the destruction of cultural heritage is a theme that now resonates and has incredible salience among a broad public. When we have the destruction of the Temple of Baal-Shamim on the cover of the New York Times by ISIS in Palmyra, that means, I think, that this kind of series of tragic events has reached a new level of public awareness. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we as scholars, we as anthropologists, have necessarily thought through what that means, what the manifold causes are, and moreover, why we might actually see this as a broad phenomena and the different kinds of locations, both historically and in the present day, that we see this kind of violence to culture. And so at Penn, what we have been encouraging over the past 2 years is a series of scholarly conversations, and they've taken place at the AAAs, at AIAs, at SAAs, and a variety of other different venues to really try and bring people together to talk about how we can study, how we might study cultural heritage destruction, violence, and conflict. And this roundtable conversation today is an outgrowth of that work, and we're very pleased that the group that we have presenting and in fact leading our conversation today is here. So I am going to invite each speaker to come up just for the simple purpose of the way that the media here transitions as a cue for that PowerPoint deck to come up. And our first speaker this afternoon is Corinne Wegner at the Smithsonian Institution. So please welcome Corey.
Thanks, Brian. So today my task is to talk to you about the Safeguarding the Heritage of Syria and Iraq project, and I suppose I should have mentioned that this is a collaborative effort between the University of Pennsylvania, Penn Cultural Heritage Center, the Smithsonian Institution's Cultural Rescue Initiative, and Anadolu Culture, which is an NGO about cultural preservation in Turkey. So first off, I think Brian kind of started the conversation with talking about how we've been looking at the destruction of cultural heritage in places around the world, but particularly in Syria and Iraq. And I think we're all familiar with the news stories about this and the extreme anxiety I think it causes in all of our cultural heritage professional networks, as well as raising the perspective around the world about the importance of preserving cultural heritage, because once it's lost forever. And shortly after I joined the Smithsonian in 2012, in 2013, we started having discussions about the destruction of heritage in Syria, basically from the Civil War, which then became more of a multidimensional conflict with armed extremist groups, etc., and then spread over into Iraq. And in 2013, a group of academics and interagency professionals who think about cultural heritage in their daily work got together to talk about what we might be able to do to help our colleagues in Syria, first of all, and then later the discussion spread to Iraq. And so that was kind of how we started our group. And here's a terrible slide, but maybe if it's that big, you can actually read some of the players. But we've had many partners since 2013 working on helping our colleagues. And the first part of this agreement was deciding that we needed to find out what the colleagues still working on the ground, and in Syria this meant basically in opposition-controlled parts of Syria, and find out what they need. And we had connections to those colleagues because of Salam Al-Kuntar, who is at the University of Pennsylvania teaching, but she's a Syrian colleague. And you'll hear more about this from our colleague Reem, who is also originally from Syria, later on. But just to say that the networks directly to the cultural heritage professionals on the ground were so important. And we worked up to the possibility of actually giving them substantive support, both in tools, materials, and funding through that network, going back to people who used to work for the Syrian Ministry of Culture and now had responsibility for sites that they were no longer getting that governmental support for. And in 2014, we held a training for some of those colleagues who crossed the border from Syria into Turkey, and we had a workshop to talk about the needs that they had, the projects they wanted to do. And I could talk all day about this, and I don't want to get the bet from Richard Leventhal, but so just I'll pinpoint a couple of the projects. One was the museum in Idlib province, the Mara Mosaics Museum, and this was a spectacular collection of mosaics that were permanently installed in the museum so that they could not, in fact, be evacuated and safeguarded. And so they had to be stabilized in place. And they told us about the project they wanted to do, what they think they needed to do it. We talked to conservators to make sure that this was possible, and here are the results of them actually putting glue material on the mosaics, covering them with fabric, and sandbagging the site. And they did this throughout some of the most important mosaics throughout the museum, which was lucky they did, because then later, not too many months later, the museum was actually hit by a very substantial barrel bomb, and the infrastructure of the building was heavily damaged, but the sandbags held, and they were able to save these mosaics and actually kept them covered and re-sandbagged the sites. And so this is just one example of how you can provide some money, tools, and materials and training to our colleagues who are actually working in a conflict situation, and have them do the work and be in charge of their own cultural heritage and be able to get the support that they need from the outside. Another one of the projects of SHOSI is the emergency consolidation at the site of Ebla. And basically, this site was being looted. There were looting pits surrounding the whole area. It was being eroded through not being able to care for the site on a regular basis. And so what our colleagues on the ground undertook was just basically building up the site, filling the looting pits. This is not, maybe the most World Heritage worthy procedure here they're doing, but this is an emergency situation. They're working with the materials available to them at the time that they can get to the site, and all of this can be redone later in a more, World heritage professional way, but this enabled the site to continue on, and they're monitoring and safeguarding it along the way. The Shosi project also has some intangible heritage efforts going on. The Hikaya project, which means story, is ongoing. We had a big pilot project, and we hope to continue this on as funding allows. And working with the local communities to engage them and explain to them why, as a displaced community, so lots of people are fleeing the bombing, and they're going to live in these ancient heritage sites. And so working with the school children to talk to them about, the loss of their own home, this place that they're calling their new home, what's the significance of it, who lived here in the past, and bringing these kids together to have these discussions. These are often traumatized school children, and so giving them a chance to talk about their experience and why they value the site. And so they're working in a lot of different media. They do projects where they talk about what the sites mean to them, what the buildings could have been, who the people were who lived there before, and allow them to do some different kinds of projects and talk about their experience. Turning to Iraq really quickly, so the Smithsonian has a relationship to the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage through, it's a long story, but through the work of the University of Delaware and with funding from the Department of State. This has been an ongoing project over the past several years to train Iraqi conservators, both from the Kurdish region and from Baghdad. And in 2015, the Shosi project was able to, with a grant provided by the Kaplan Foundation and some other donors, to provide an emergency training workshop for some of those same heritage professionals at the Iraqi Institute. And we were able to welcome them back after the critical time when ISIS had been very much, got moved very close to Erbil, actually. And we were able to reopen in 2015 to provide some of the same type of emergency training that we'd done with our Syrian colleagues, talking about site preservation, preserving archaeological sites, working with collections, if you have to evacuate collections, how you actually do that. And it was, we had some of our colleagues come, this is Abdul Hamid Salah from Egypt, who has had a lot of experience responding to cultural emergencies in his own home country, and training them about how to respond to a bombing situation for a heritage site like a museum or an archive. And so in closing, I'd just like to quickly talk about, we're all watching with bated breath the invasion of Mosul right now to retake it from ISIS. And in response to that, Shosi started thinking several months ago about what we could do to try to mitigate the potential damage to cultural heritage in this big epic battle that was to come. So we created the Guide to Mosul Heritage in Arabic and Kurdish. It's a training aid for military who were working in Iraq, and we worked with the U.S. Army trainers to be able to distribute that to Iraqi Peshmerga and Iraqi Army units. And we were able to get it done, thankfully, with a grant from the State Department, kind of just-in-time situation for that to be handed out prior to the invasion of Mosul. I think only research and time will tell how much impact this had, how much the units actually utilized the tool, but it was there for them. It goes over basically a small number of sites in and around the environs of Mosul and points up to them the importance of awareness of the 1954 Hague Convention to protect cultural property in the event of armed conflict. Tips up to them that Iraq is a signatory to that treaty, so is the United States, and while ISIS may not pay attention to that, as a professional military actor, they do need to pay attention to it and to follow the guidelines that we all follow under international humanitarian law. And so just a slide, of course, to thank our donors. There are a number of donors that have provided support to Shosi over the past several years, and also a number of agencies and academic institutions and professional organizations that have contributed to our knowledge and ability to do this work. So thanks. I'll be followed by Dr. Brian Daniels.
Thank you, Corey. As I've been introduced, I am Brian Daniels, and I am back again to talk about some of the ideas that were undergirding the conversations that were happening as part of the SHOSI project. One of the things that became abundantly clear to us, as we were talking with Corey, as we were engaging in a broad international dialogue around cultural heritage destruction and the kind of risks that culture was facing because of the armed conflict in Syria and then later in Iraq, we really began to reflect, I think, internally as a field, that we don't know as much as we think we should about the phenomena of cultural heritage destruction. And so what we began to do, again, was to have these small sets of conversations to think about how we might pull together broader research about this subject. It's almost axiomatic that the Bamyan Buddha destruction in 2001 became this touchstone for the field of anthropology about cultural loss. And that specific event is often referenced, but it's not the only example of cultural heritage destruction in a period of violence. And what we really began grappling with is, well, what's the distribution of this? Why is cultural heritage targeted? What kind of research community do we actually need to develop? An interdisciplinary research community that includes anthropologists and political scientists and peace and conflict studies to really think through and ask and answer questions that are theoretically driven, and not just bemoaning the fact that cultural heritage that we care about has been lost. And really also driving at the question, what kinds of research and methods are fundamentally required if we are going to take this seriously as a subject of study? And so together, the University of Pennsylvania, the Smithsonian, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science embarked on an NSF-sponsored project to really begin to think through and grapple with these questions. It wasn't as if this wasn't a typical National Science Foundation grant in that we were aiming to arrive at answers to any of these questions. What we were entering with was an exploration process about how we could gather a community of scholars together to really say, over the next 5 to 10 years, we want to seriously address this as an area of research because this is a policy problem, this is an under-addressed area in anthropology, and this is an under-addressed problem in political science, international relations, and peace and conflict studies as well, who don't necessarily treat culture or religion as key variables of analysis the same way we would as anthropologists. And so in many ways, this was about a dialogue of everybody coming together and thinking through what we might be able to develop together. And so after 2 years, we brought together a group of 16 different national and international organizations that have all said, okay, we're willing to actually try, we're willing to explore, we're willing to actually think through what kinds of research questions we can collaborate on together, what kinds of research we might want to encourage our graduate students to follow, what kinds of research we want to undertake in our own scholarship as it relates to cultural heritage destruction. And so the network is a network of scholars. It's not a formal kind of thing at all, but it's an invitation for the fields to engage more broadly with the topic. And one of the things that we were really trying to do in this conversation, in this engagement, is think about what kinds of information, what kinds of data we would all like in our disparate fields to actually use to understand the phenomenon of heritage destruction. And if we think about anthropology, we focus so much on the case study and the deep ethnographic research that goes into the case, or the archival research if we approached it in a more historical manner. But we also know that case study has its own limitations. And it has some limitations I'll talk about in a moment when it comes to international law. And so what we found is that we need to actually think about how we could approach this in terms of both the individual case and in terms of comparative cases by collecting essentially data points, almost adopting the political science articulation of event analysis for instances of cultural heritage destruction. And so using test data for the Syria conflict, and using a process that's very normal in other fields to collect media-level data, we developed a guidebook for the Syrian conflict between 2011 and 2014 to look at the distribution of events of cultural destruction or cultural loss across the entire country. And so looking at Syria for a period of 2011 to 2014, we generated approximately 660 events in Syria that met our individual criteria. And then we replicated it for Iraq for 2003 to 2014 and came up with 1,100 events using the same criteria. Now, each one of these individual events could be studied ethnographically or contextually as its own case study. But in terms of our colleagues in political science, they're very interested in the cross-comparative cases. And when we actually look at the breakdown of our event-level data, we actually see something quite interesting. So this is 2011 through 2014 in Syria, the distribution of roughly the 660 events. And the green bars that you see at the far left are religious sites, mosques, shrines, churches, temples. And the blue bar next to the green are archaeological sites. And the overwhelming amount of attention that you see in the media is about archaeological site looting and ISIS, or archaeological site looting and other figures in the Syrian conflict. And it's not as if this is unimportant. Colleagues and I wrote a New York Times op-ed piece in September 2014 after we returned from the Turkish border, after interviewing our Syrian colleagues, as Corey just discussed, who actually could provide what was then some of the firsthand evidence of ISIS's use of the illicit trade as a funding source. But I say this having written that op-ed, it was never, I think, our intention to say that that should be the only focus. And unfortunately, that has become much of the only policy discussion, and oftentimes some of the only research discussion as well, ignoring the fact that if we look at the sheer aggregate number of events and the number of damaged heritage sites overall, what we're really looking at is the rise in the targeting of religious sites, which says something else, we think, about the underlying dynamic of the Syrian conflict, how it took on a sectarian character, and ultimately what this means for the study of cultural heritage loss more broadly. This is a field that we know is dominated by archaeologists. Archaeologists generally generate the list of cultural heritage sites for a country, and it overwhelmingly overrepresents archaeological sites, ancient ruins, and so on. But what it seems to us after going through this process over the past couple of years is that we need to pay far more attention to the religious dimension when we talk about cultural heritage, and we need to be talking about religious heritages in the plural. One of the other factors of this planning process we were very much encouraged in the dialogues is that we had to make sure that we were actually contextualizing cultural heritage destruction. It's simply not enough to say that a site is damaged or not damaged or destroyed or not destroyed. We need to say something about the conflict dynamics that go on around the site. Because what we're really trying to study here, I think, is how cultural heritage destruction itself is emblematic of conflict. And this is an understudied dimension of violence. And so our colleagues of the American Association for the Advancement of Science took heritage sites, which are red dots here, and then looked at a radius around the site, so 2.5-kilometer radius, to see what other kinds of conflict were occurring around those sites. And one of the things that they found was that in any given site, there were multiple military vehicles, fortifications, or roadblocks. Other evidence of conflict is present. And so this might be emblematic of collateral damage, but it's also a reflection of the militarization of cultural heritage sites, which is something that we need to study more broadly as well. And so where we are, at least in our own pilot work, is trying to understand the relationship of the intensity of fighting and the event level damage that we see at different cultural heritage locations. And you can see this distribution map of our event level data correlated with conflict level data collected by political scientists for the same Syria conflict. And one of the reasons why we think this is absolutely crucial to the overall project of humanitarian law here, and why we need to think about this more comparatively, is that there has been a tendency in recent cultural heritage war crimes and crimes against humanity cases for the ICTY, for the former Yugoslav Tribunal, to actually discount the possibility that cultural heritage destruction is a form of systematic persecution against people. The reason for this is in judicial forums, the evidence is described as a single case. So it's one case of a mosque being destroyed, but the courts have come back and said in this case, one example of that, one in-depth case study by an anthropologist does not systematic persecution make. And what we're being challenged as, on the legal side of human rights, if we're going to take cultural heritage seriously as a war crime or evidence of systematic persecution of a population, then we really have to think about this comparatively and think about the different venues in which we see that persecution more broadly. And I think that that's where this project is heading, and it's something that we look forward to continuing with in future work. I'm going to invite you to follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and visit our website, conflictculture.info. And I hope that you will be interested in engaging with us as we continue on our work on this project in the future. Thank you very much. And now it is my pleasure to invite up to the podium Rim Labadi to talk about her work in Syria. So Rim.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Brian. My name is Rim Lababidi. I am an architect from Syria, Aleppo. I'm here to speak about my experience as a Syrian and as a cultural heritage specialist about what's happening in Syria. I left Aleppo, Syria in August 2012. And that was to continue my studies on archaeology of the Arab and Islamic world at UCL. Actually, when I applied first for the master, my plan was to study the urban development of the Islamic city of Aleppo. But unfortunately, my plans had to change. And that was because almost 1 month before I left the city, the armed confrontations reached Aleppo, and accordingly, I had to witness the destruction. And at that point, it wasn't destruction, but it was severe damage to 3 key assets of old Aleppo, and those are the citadel, the souk, and the Umayyad Mosque. But unfortunately also, that wasn't only sold to Aleppo. Almost all of the key cultural sites of Syria were subject around the same period to the damage imposed by the conflict. So as a response to the conflict, I thought that like a first aid plan to safeguard the heritage of the city would be a good idea. And that was the subject of my master thesis. And when I was planning for my thesis, I thought that it would be good if I have a map of the old city and just to process the data about the damage and then propose the first aid plan for it. And I started contacting specialists who worked previously on the rehabilitation projects of Aleppo, which were a long process, like for 2 decades, and I was hoping for some support. and I was shocked by their answers. The answers of those specialists were either that they don't have plans for Aleppo, which is a big lie, or that they are happy to share the plans of Old Aleppo with me if I pay. And at that moment, I just decided to start from scratch. So I was able to identify in this map over 270 cultural assets within the ancient enclosure of Old Aleppo. And I identified 4 levels of damage to the heritage of the city, and that is minor damage, moderate, severe, and total destruction. And actually, this mosque here is the same one here, like it totally turned into rubbles. And I reflected the data that I got at that time into GIS maps, and again, at that time, there were actually no initiatives working on this yet. It was probably only like APSA. And I have been since then updating my data and cross-referencing them with other initiatives working on the same subject. Oops, sorry. Now, during my research also, I was able to identify several challenges to the post-conflict period that I think or believe that a first aid plan might help us to embrace these challenges. And some of the challenges is the extent of the damage, the sheer extent of the damage. I mean, for example, in the case of Aleppo, we're talking about an enclosure that is 361 hectares. So it's huge, and it's severely damaged. Second is lack of capacities, and that is on governmental, social, and legal levels. Third is corruption and nepotism, of course. 4 is lack of cooperation and coordination, as I mentioned before with the plan story. And 5 is the needs of the local community. And here I would like to take few seconds to explain for you about the local community. Old Aleppo is a historic center that is accumulation of several periods of history, and like a combination of different ethnicities, sectarian, religious groups, and everybody lives in a good way together. For the people of Aleppo in general, the historic city was the perfect place to go have some cultural activities like visiting museums and exhibitions. It was a perfect place to go for a good dinner because food in Aleppo is a very important thing. And it had the markets that for us Aleppians, we believed that it had the best things in Aleppo. So that made the markets a very, very visited place, and actually that made them the economic wheel, not only of the city, but the entire country. And finally, and most important, is that Old Aleppo is a home for over 200,000 people. And those people, they had high levels of poverty from before the war. So imagine now with everything happening. And I have always been concerned about how can we balance the needs of these different people, and how can we make sure that the reconstruction plan won't favor the investors or those in power. In June 2016, I was fortunate to attend the First Aid to Cultural Heritage in Crisis course. It was a course organized by ICROM and the Smithsonian, and it was a great experience. It shaped my research, and it really put me on the right direction. And it was during the same course when I met Brian Daniels, and we started collaborating together on the Conflict Culture Research Network. Now, I have been helping and assisting the interns working on collecting the data as a Syrian, as a local, and I have maybe sometimes information that they need to research in order to obtain it, so sometimes I make it easier. And the other thing is that I have been kind of helping them and putting them on the right path for for collecting data or providing information that sometimes the barrier of language could make it difficult for them. However, during my studies and my work on this subject, I have had several observations that I would like to share it today with you. First of all, the Syrian people are traumatized. I'm sorry. And there is a political division in the country, and it is the main division in the country. This political division is coming basically from the regime people and pro-regime people. And it has also another levels, and we have another levels of, we can say, like sensitivities among the sectarian or ethnic different groups of the country or of the city of Aleppo in this case. And unfortunately, because of everything happening, people tend to be self-protective, and that's normal. So whenever something happens, like to heritage, they might respond in a way saying that, why would I care for historic buildings when death toll is so great? Or why would I care for what happens to for example, like an Armenian church when I am like a Muslim or even Arab Christian, and I'm in a different group and I feel like I'm safe and I have access to basic needs like water. So the very difficult surrounding and context of war made people very kind of isolated, and not in conflict, but isolated. Like they care for themselves and for the safety of their own, and they don't really care for what others do. However, in this dark context, still we have a hope. So for example, in August, like 3 months ago, there was attack on the citadel of Aleppo. And in this attack, part of the walls of the citadel collapsed. And the people, regardless of their religion or of their ethnicity or their sect, whatever, they all went furious about it. And they were claiming to know who did it. And the surprise was that neither the regime nor the armed opposition adopted really the operation, because they were really afraid that things will go crazy if they do. And until now, we don't know who did it. But by that example, I want to say that public spaces that have general affiliation to people can really play as a common ground where people from different sides, from different backgrounds can meet together and unite when the times come for the post-conflict reconstruction. Another thing that I have been witnessing, like last year I attended a conference where most of the key initiatives working on Syrian heritage, like they had representatives and they were speaking about what they think and what they see for Syrian heritage. And I was really in shock. And I felt like we're completely left behind. And I asked them, what about what Syrians think about their heritage? And what about how Syrians want their heritage to be in the future? And they told me, some of them answered that they did surveys on this. But I took these surveys, and it was just 6 questions about prioritizing some sites. And the focus group of these surveys were specialists who, some of them were Syrians. And I'm sorry, but this is not a Syrian perception of heritage. So we really need to have studies on how Syrians think of their heritage and how they want it to be in the future. And lastly, as a Syrian again, the Syrian crisis has turned into an international crisis where everyone kind of like related to it or like influencing it. And and as heritage is always a political theater, So that made it even worse for heritage. And I think you remember in April, after the Russian recapture of Palmyra, how Russia was very proud to announce that they want to reconstruct Palmyra. And unfortunately, the head of UNESCO said that she's very happy about this proposal, although that Syrian people went mental about it and they were very, very upset. And they were like, we don't want people who are bombing us and killing us to reconstruct our heritage. It's ours and we want to control it. So in this all like very complex context, we are still, as Syrians, feel like kind of left behind and like underrepresented, and we're not very optimistic about the future, but we're hoping with like contextual and unbiased studies like that is being done by the Conflict Culture Research Network, maybe we can hopefully have like some hope for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Reem. It's important, I think, when we talk about heritage and conflict that we always bear in mind just how much this kind of violence affects the people on the ground who suffer through it and persevere. So thank you so much, Reem. I'm next going to invite Tiffany Kane from the University of Pennsylvania up to the podium. So, Tiffany?
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to be shifting us in gears a little bit. The focus has been on Syria and Iraq and these incredible projects that are going on. And I want to take us to broadening the question of how we think about violence and destruction and heritage as an assemblage of issues, theoretical issues, and also on-the-ground issues, as Reem has just so eloquently described for us. My work, sort of the central question to the work that I've been doing with Richard Leventhal in Quintana Roo, Mexico, has focused on sort of two trajectories. One, very much so, is about how communities think about their own heritage and what happens when heritage professionals and practitioners try to impose that on them. And that's something that Richard is going to be speaking a little bit more about before we finish it with our introductions. But the other side of that then is, from an archaeological perspective, how we actually think about violence and conflict in the past and the post-conflict situation that it creates. And one of the central questions for me and my thinking around this has been, well, how do communities actually respond to political violence? And I am drawn to this idea of political violence in particular versus conflict or warfare for precisely the reason that many of the conversations that we have around it isolate violence in the past and in the present as a sort of event, right? That can be thought of as something that happens in a moment or a flashpoint, when really what you end up having is these long histories of structural and social violence that creates imbalances, creates poverty, creates other kinds of systematic oppression that then provide the context for how violence actually unfolds. And when we think about that in a post-conflict sphere, we end up often forgetting to account for those things. And so my focus has been on this issue of how do we identify how communities are actually responding to violence in the past, and what is the impact that response has on how that conflict is understood in the future or in the post-conflict period. And central to that, I think, is how do we think about how violence actually materializes? One of the ways that violence materializes in an incredibly visual sense is through destruction, right? Through the annihilation of something, through the creation of rubbles and the creation of ruins. But there are other ways, I think, from an archaeological and anthropological perspective that we need to be thinking about what violence actually looks like materially. And sometimes I think that a major question should be surrounding how everyday objects, how things that are normal to everyday life become reinscribed with new purposes and new functions during conflict periods. And so one stream of my work thinks about two sort of classic categories in archaeological research especially, but also in thinking about violence in the past, which are fortification and abandonment. And I bring these up because where I work, the way that towns are constructed, so I work in Quintana Roo, Mexico, is a Maya area, and a very long-term technology of construction is to create interconnected house lots that are built up with walls that are made of dry-laid stone, right? They're these very uninteresting looking piles of rock that create this region's equivalent to the white picket fence, right? Okay, so as archaeologists, we go into an area, we see these, and that's all they are. They're walls, and they delineate social spaces. Maybe we have questions about social organization in the past. All of that's very straightforward. But what happens when we are conscious of what a violent context could actually reinscribe these very mundane objects, these very mundane things to be? What happens when ordinary people take a technology that they have been using constantly and reinscribe it for the purposes of fortification, for example? And why do people choose to fortify? Why do people stay, right, in conflict zones? And how can us thinking about the ways that these materials take on new sorts of meanings within violent spaces inform us about how we are interpreting what violence looks like in the past? So what you see here on the right is an artist's rendition of one of the towns that would have existed in this region in the late 19th century when the caste war of Yucatan, which was arguably one of the most successful indigenous insurrections in the Americas, was underway. And these little rocks here are one of these walls that have created roadblocks. And this is a depiction of one of the battles, the fights. So thinking about the sort of new roles of particular kinds of materials that if we are not conscious about and if we don't take seriously these kinds of conflicts in the past, our interpretations may end up leaving out. What does abandonment look like? Well, one, you have regional abandonment in this area. So for over 80 years, the region was generally free of population. And that's a pretty, no people, no bodies, nobody, right, is a pretty obvious form of abandonment, and the kinds of refugee situations that were created because of this conflict are become obvious by the fact that there's nobody there. But there are other kinds of things that we might be thinking about, like the mundane category of metate, grinding stones, right, that we are often so interested in as archaeologists. And then if we do not think about the fact that the context that these are found in is a context of post-conflict, that what we're looking at is metates left in place on the surface in spaces that look like they can be used. And the last time that we know of their use would have been during conflict, right? These are the kinds of things that I'm asking us. Why aren't we asking these questions of everyday materials to help us think through how people actually coped with violence, why people chose to stay in particular places, and what this process of fortification and community creating around that might have actually looked like. So to just close my brief comments on my thoughts around actually thinking about conflict in the past, I want to sort of lead into what Richard will close with after Dr. Watkins. And what you have here on the right is the cathedral in the town that we work in that was at the epicenter of this particular war that was bombed, intentionally destroyed during the middle of the conflict, and has stood as a monument to the conflict since, and has been interpreted in many ways by the community, and has also been intentionally left destroyed by that same community, because really the question is not only about how does violence actually materialize and look in the past, but how does violence actually create and generate new forms of cultural heritage in the future? And how is violence inscribed in a way that, if it is removed, it is an active choice to remove that inscription. Or if we reconstruct, that is an active choice. And it is an active choice that is contextualized through the availability of things like resources and infrastructure and people's support. And we also have a situation where the community had, after 80 years, been repopulated in the early 1930s. And you have a process of repopulation where among the many things that happen during that period, people start to repopulate these colonial homes, which under other circumstances, and within this one in some ways, could be read as a source of negative heritage. These are homes that were built to reinforce the power and wealth of a settler community that was using Maya labor and Maya bodies to further their wealth, right? And this is a form of structural and systematic violence that creates the context for the actual war that we're thinking about. But on the other hand, you have a narrative around the repopulation and reinhabitation of these spaces that says, well, sure, you could think about them that way. We get that. They were, spaces of the oppressor, but they were also built on our backs, right? And so really they're ours. And you can't tell us that they weren't ours because we built them. We just weren't in a position to be able to, have them as ours, to enjoy them as our spaces. And so this has become a reinscription in a post-conflict situation. And so some of the things that I just have wanted to push us to think about in my involvement in the research network in general is, what happens after destruction, and how are we going to talk about this in the future when we think back on what violence looked like in this situation, and how we talk about why people choose to stay and create new collective communities and identities around spaces that might otherwise be written off as or only identified as places that ought to create sort of negative heritage, right? So I guess that's where I'll stop with these comments. Thanks.
I'd now like to invite up Joe Watkins from the National Park Service.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we are meeting. I'd also like to say halito chikma siya Joe Watkins, siya Choctaw, Oklahoma, o mishki anumpotel fasha ish haklo, which is Choctaw for saying hello. My name is Joe Watkins. I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Hark, listen to my words. Title of my short talk today is The Destruction of Heritage and Conflict. But what I really want to look at are the indirect impacts of conflict on Native American heritage. These are the sorts of scenes we've been unfortunately growing all too used to seeing in the news, the destruction in the Middle East of what can be interpreted to be international heritage, even though they exist within the boundaries of a single nation. However, in the United States, the military branches, the U.S. Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force, and the National Guard, the forces that we send to international conflict, of course, have a need to be trained. And that training is not done in a classroom situation with virtual, not only with virtual weaponry. However, it is conducted in military bases across the United States. In 1996, President Clinton passed Executive Order 13007, subtitled Indian Sacred Sites, which required that all federal bureaus, federal agencies looked at the impact of their actions on sites of heritage importance to American Indian groups, sacred sites, as well as just cultural resource sites, and to recognize that they had a responsibility to allow American Indians to have access to those sites. What I'd like to do a little bit today just is provide a couple of quick examples of sort of the indirect impacts that the U.S. Army can have and has had on sites of importance to American Indians. One example is at Fort Sill in southwest Oklahoma. Another is at Fort Drum in northeast New York. Fort Sill, located in southwest Oklahoma near the town of Lawton, is a training center for primarily for infantry. Also, it's an area where they practice a great deal of shooting off of very large projectiles at targets 20, 30 miles distant. The area where these located is within the traditional lands of the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Apache, Wichita, and other tribes in southwestern Oklahoma. It's also the location of where the prisoners of wars from what have become known as the Fort Sill Apache tribe, the Chiricahua and the Warm Springs Apache, where they were placed between 1886 and 1914. The photograph on the left in this slide was taken by William Sewell in 1886, and it depicts one of the 7 villages of the Fort Sill Apache tribe. That particular area is an area of very special importance to the tribe as part of a traditional cultural property for the Fort Sill Apache tribe. The structures, which looked a great deal like the structures in contemporary Lawton in the 1860s and 70s, no longer exist. You could recognize that these sorts of structures would be a hazard for training Army personnel, so they were systematically razed, destroyed, especially used as targeting areas for some of the artillery, as well as when you think about trying to run heavy machinery through there, it's important really to do away with those structural impediments. Another area still on Fort Sill on the left is another photograph by William Sewell. It's a place called Medicine Bluff, an area of specific and very special importance to the Comanche, the Kiowa, again, the Apache tribe. Actually, this area is still used by traditional practitioners of the Comanche as a place for individual quests, if you will, vision quests. They still have some fasting vigils there. In 2008, the Comanche tribe sought an injunction to prevent Fort Sill from constructing a warehouse in the vicinity of their southern approaches to Medicine Bluffs. Fort Sill, which said that the construction of the warehouse would not fringe upon religious rights because the warehouse is more than 1,600 feet away from the southern approaches, also contended that it had complied with federal regulations to notify the Comanche about the work, and that the Comanche responded with no objections. However, a district court judge found that Fort Sill had violated the religious rights of the Comanche by not acting and following the National Historic Preservation Act, at least in good faith efforts. The judge said, quote, "It has been said that the National Historic Preservation Act requires an agency to stop, look, and listen, but the evidence in the present case suggests that the defendants, Fort Sill, merely paused, glanced, and turned a deaf ear to the warnings of adverse impact." Again, another example is Fort Drum near the Canadian border in New York. It's used by National Guard personnel as a training facility. Military exercises require clean landing zones, and personnel moving through the area provide continual impacts to items of importance. Lori Rush, the Cultural Resources Program Manager at Fort Drum, has stepped in to prevent military maneuvers from impacting areas of significance relating to ceremonial stone landscapes. The landscapes, while not perhaps immediately recognizable by military personnel, can easily be disturbed by armored vehicles, field clearing, or other actions, even unintentional in nature. But Lori has determined that if you are going to talk to military commanders about the impacts, you generally have a very short time frame within which to maintain the attention span of these commanders. You talk about safety, they listen. You talk about bringing personnel back from the field, they listen. But if you start talking about impact to heritage, you have to phrase it in such a term so that they can recognize that they can help you protect the heritage while continuing to meet the needs of the mission. So in that regard, while truly not as blatant as the destruction of heritage that's ongoing now in the Middle East, military training will always be necessary. The impact on heritage to American Indian heritage sites here in North America is always going to be there. There's going to be an impact, maybe not as unfortunate, direct as what's going on in the Middle East, but there's always going to be the possibility and the probability of that indirect impact. So therefore, it's up to us to find ways to communicate the need so that the idea of completing a mission is not placed ahead of the idea of heritage protection. So thank you.
And I'll now invite up to the podium again Richard Leventhal for his presentation and some concluding remarks. So, Richard?
Great, thank you very much. I have sort of two jobs now. I'd like to talk a little bit about post-conflict issues and bring us back very briefly to Mexico, and to talk about developments and changes that we can see as we look at and study the nature of heritage post-conflict, and the nature of the identification of heritage within a post-conflict situation. And the second job is to bring together a few conclusions and talk about some of the directions that we're going to move in the future with this project and with this research network. But let me start with, in fact, Mexico, and to think a little bit about post-conflict in Mexico in terms of this caste war that Tiffany Kane mentioned to you and discussed with you a little bit. And it's obviously not possible for us to think about post-conflict in Syria at this point. The conflict is still going on. There are a lot of political changes that are coming about due to the election in the United States, due to the players on the ground in Syria. So we really can't look at that, but we need to think about the types of models and the ideas that will frame the nature of the post-conflict activities in a place like Syria. One of the things I think that's very important is to think of, as we think about the construct of the preservation of the Maya, back to Mexico just very briefly, do we think about this preservation of the ancient Maya as just the ancient Maya? And unfortunately, I think we do most of the time. We think about Maya culture, we speak about Maya culture as being in the past. The 6 to 10 million tourists who go to Cancun every year for fun and recreation are taught about the Maya in a very simple framing of they don't exist today, but you can go visit what the remnants of their great culture, something of the past. So I think the same question has to be asked of Syria. Is the preservation of Syria in the future, this post-conflict model, is it in fact the preservation of ancient Syria? And what we've seen, in fact, from what Reem was saying, from what Brian was saying, from what others were saying, is that most of the heritage professionals who are thinking about Syria and focused on Syria are doing the exact same thing that we find in Mexico, which is they're thinking about the archaeological sites. They're focused on something that's very large, very easy to identify as being important in its heritage. And I think this is a problem that Brian clearly identified in the sense that generally that's not what people on the ground think is heritage, what communities on the ground think is heritage. Clearly, moving back to Mexico, Maya heritage at archaeological sites like Chichen Itza is very important. It's a critical economic framing for the country of Mexico. Does it benefit local people within Maya communities nearby? And the answer tends to be a very conditional yes. It's a bit of a trickle down, not a major impact in terms of real change in social and economic inequality. So if you begin to get away from the tourist locations in Mexico and you go to some of the towns that are occupied by the Maya that are not focused upon tourism at this point, you come to a town like Teosuco that you can see here with the church that Tiffany talked about on the left. This is a church that was reconstructed in this post-conflict time zone, but was left open, as you can see here, very much consciously as a symbol of the blood that was spilled during this massive war in the 19th century. In addition, in the middle of their town is a statue of one of the leaders of this rebellion, Jacinto Pat, and I'll mention him again in just a few minutes. But this is what they're focused upon in these types of communities. And as we think about this, this is, again, a different type of heritage than professionals think about. As archaeologists, we think about ancient sites. We need to think about what people on the ground, what communities are identifying as heritage. I think this is what Reem was really talking about and focused upon. It was so important. And so, in fact, we are talking about this massive rebellion called the Caste War in the Yucatan, the La Guerra de Castas in Yucatan, between 1847 and 1901. People talk about it as if it is still continuing today, and that this moment of resistance has continued for more than 150 years. They're putting up monuments to it, as you can see on the left. They're putting up murals talking about Maya as living people, not as just part of an ethnographic museum. And this is another representation of this rebellion. This rebellion was one of the largest wars in Mexico's history. Tens of thousands of people were killed, hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, massive amounts of heritage, massive amounts of primary sacred locations were destroyed during this time period. Nobody knows about it in the United States. Nobody knows about it in Mexico, except within the Yucatan. It's not taught in the schools of Mexico City. And again, even the remembrance of something like this is part of the heritage of this region. And then this is the representation, a photograph of the church in Teosuco after the region was reoccupied in this is probably about 1960s. And it is a destroyed sacred site that eventually gets slightly reconstructed through the auspices of a bit of the government and a bit of the local community. This is what the church looks like today, and as I said, it is a massive church. It is a symbol very much of this war, but it's also a symbol of the continuity of Maya culture in this 21st century, and the vision of where the Maya people are going to remember the past, and not just to see it as both an ancient past that's long gone or a past that's been destroyed. One of the interesting things is we've got a conflict here in terms of the nature of the landscape, because there's a tourist landscape and there's a local heritage landscape tied to the Maya people. And the heritage landscape is really within this region of where the people are living today, the Maya people are living today, and tourists really tend not to go there. And this is the center of the rebellion, another central part of this rebellion from the 19th century. The tourist landscape is really running along the coast up to Cancun, and from Cancun over to Chichen Itza, an ancient Maya site. So this landscape itself shows you the contrast between the active, living nature of the community and in many respects, a very different interpretation of what that community and what that landscape and what heritage really is. And it's not the local community that's talking about that heritage. It's really the tourist one. Within the town is the Museum of the Caste War, with images of the leaders of the caste war, and this is really sacred images, sacred landscape, a sacred identification that this is the center of this rebellion. And then out in the jungle, really quite interesting, because when I first went to this community and asked about remnants from this rebellion, the response from the community was, we don't have any, there's nothing remains from this rebellion. And they were willing to let me dig an archaeological site if I wanted to take stuff home with me and buy it from them. What they were not willing to do was to show me the remnants of this incredibly sacred moment in the past, this rebellion. And it took 2 years and I didn't know I was going to ever find this, but it took 2 years before they were willing to take me out into the jungle and show me what they had been saving for 80 or 90 years. And it is buildings like this out in the jungle. It's a church like this that's out in the jungle. It's completely abandoned, but it is sacred to the people of this community. And they do sort of want to show it slightly to other people, but they want to control the story. And this is the work that we are now doing within the town. And then here is one of the great leaders of this rebellion, Jacinto Pat. We don't have a drawing or photograph of him. This is a reconstruction of what he might have looked like. But here is the monument in the middle of town. It's fiberglass, but they painted the sharpened edge of his machete to show him as a fierce warrior going off into battle. And here is where his house was. This is sacred ground, as Mount Vernon is to us. This is sacred ground for the people of Teosuco in this region. This is where his house was, where he lived, and it is something that they have come to us specifically with the request to how do we save it? This is important to us. No one else in Mexico thinks this is important. This is important. How do we save it? And then just to go back into the town, which is really an interesting contrast, as Tiffany was talking about, which are these buildings that are very much the buildings of the wealthy people that they were fighting against during this rebellion, that they have reoccupied now, and they've reincorporated into their story and their vision of what the town represents, what the community represents, and what this rebellion represents to them. And just finally, this slide that really shows, these are slides from about 1970, and it really shows how the people are living within this sacred landscape and living within this in a post-conflict world before Reconstruction really happens. This was during a festival there that I was able to find some slides from roughly 50 years ago. But you can see in the bottom left the church sitting there, still destroyed, but it's being incorporated into the landscape of heritage and of activity today within this Maya community. And I think this is so important to think about. Heritage is not being something necessarily that we as professionals can identify easily. Over and over the last 2 years, 2 or 3 years, as we've been working on this research network, as we've been working on the nature of cultural heritage destruction in Syria and Iraq, we have found that people who are perceived to be the professionals, perceived to know what heritage is, identify really only one class of heritage of the past, not a heritage that's complicated, not a heritage that's dealing with local communities. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to begin to think about different nature of heritage, alternative concepts of heritage, and in fact integrate local communities into the identification of heritage. This is what Reem was talking about. Syrians cannot be marginalized in identification of what heritage is in Syria today, in the future, in this post-conflict world that occurs. Russia is trying to do it. UNESCO is trying to do it. These, I mean, in particular, UNESCO should be incorporating Syrian ideas and constructs in it. They're not. They're simply going to do it with their model and their idea. The other thing I think is very critical is that as we began to study this process of heritage destruction, there was an awful lot of wringing of hands and tearing out of hair to say, it's bad what ISIS is doing. This is a terrible thing. But nobody was really studying it. And I will very much turn to my colleague Brian Daniels to say he was bent upon this idea that we can study heritage, we can study the destruction of heritage within this region, even with the ongoing war. And I think he's been able to prove himself to be correct. And so that the nature of violence, the nature of violent destruction of heritage can be studied not in a single dimension, but in a multidimensional framing for both what is heritage, how it's destroyed, who is destroying it, what the context of that destruction is. And to me, that's some of the most important things that we've learned over the past 2 or 3 years. So with those brief comments, I'd like to say thank you all very much for coming. And now actually perhaps open it up for conversation. We are a very small group. This is an auditorium of, they've told me, 2,000, 3,000. I mean, there are 25 of us here. And instead of us coming up and being very formal about it, I think I'm just going to sit on the edge here, and if there are some comments, if you could just speak up a little bit. We don't even need to use the mics in a formal way. I'd just like to hear if there are some questions or comments, and people here can answer. We can start a conversation rather than just a one-way dialogue. I'm kind of tired of the one-way approach to the AAAs and other things. So if we could start a conversation, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, some of the issues is that the tribal members recognize that they can protect the sites sometimes by not telling people where they are. So the Army has developed these electronic posts, which what they will do is they will tell an Army person that they are starting to move into protected space. So the personnel do not know whether it's an active minefield, whether it's a staging area. They get an auditory notification that they are moving into areas where they're not supposed to be. So by working with cultural resource managers on the Army bases, the tribes or tribal managers can better ensure that lands of importance to them are protected. However, part of the issue as well is that very often some of the sites of importance are not just small, discrete areas that can be easily isolated. As you can tell with the Fort Sill-Apache, the villages, they could have a general idea of where those villages were located, but after 75 to 100 years of the military using it as training grounds, there's really nothing on the ground that can identify it as a heritage area. The tribes see it based on its relationship with their tribal history. So with most of the tribes that I've worked with, and especially with military forts, we found that the best thing to do is to notify them of very general areas, slightly larger than the areas they want to protect. The base managers, if they are told and if they are hit over the head with regulations, they have a tendency to understand, especially if you say the commander-in-chief has indicated that these areas are of importance to be preserved and protected, they'll buy into that. But if you can make an argument that you can use these areas in such a way that you don't impact them, but they can be used as a part of some of your staging areas, then again, if we can help them understand how they can accomplish their mission, then the tribes are very much happy to help them do so.
Just very quickly, I think it's interesting, your comments, because, I mean, part of this idea that sacredness tends to be something that people are able to identify. I mean, in some sense, sacredness is oftentimes something that's hidden away and kept hidden and not identified in a public construct. With stuff I'm talking about, stuff you're talking about, Tiffany, others, I think this is very much, and part of that is the framing of what happens when it becomes public and what the results can be, which is oftentimes either exploitation or potential destruction of it. And so I think that there's an interesting framing of that nature of sacredness. Why don't you come on up?
Hi, my name is Elif Kalaycıoğlu. I'm actually in the Department of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. And this is very nice for me to hear because I'm writing my dissertation in international relations, where it takes still some argument to convince why cultural heritage should be sort of immediate interest. And I think my question is mostly to Brian Daniels and Reem Labadibi. So I'm trying to look at these different moments of destruction, and some of it was coming in your presentations already, the sort of kinds of destructions that we're seeing over and over in media, which are certainly not the only kinds of heritage destruction that we're witnessing. And so one of the cases that I'm focusing on, I'm from Turkey, and a lot has been happening around the World Heritage Site in Diyarbakir as well. And also, I think in Syria, it's very interesting that both the son and father Assad have long been understood as patrons of heritage in this community, right? They were one of the first to invite the international expert community, etc. So I think I would want to ask if in your research so far, and just as a last parenthetical, in World Heritage, this is especially problematic because you're positioning states as the guardians of heritage, right? So I think in your research so far and the information you've been collecting, whether you've also been parsing it in terms of the actors that might be initiating the violence and how sort of heritage destruction by state actors are being approached quite differently by the heritage community, and how we might have sort of some traction on that.
This is in general a problematic issue, especially like we were talking about this earlier when it comes to the international community, because like in organizations like UNESCO or its partners, they only deal with governmental bodies, and they know most of the time of the problems, or like whether on a very like corruption or lacking capacities really, or even now in the context of war, they will just continue to work with them. So I don't know really how to put it like further, but I mean in general this is very, very problematic, and I don't know how or what will happen later.
I think in terms of data collection and what it actually means to build data sets of instances of cultural heritage destruction such that they're studyable, that we feel comfortable as anthropologists, one of the things that we have to do is to gather and identify as much cultural information, contextual information surrounding a particular event. And I will say this has been a learning process for me in dealing with the IR and the political science communities. I think a learning experience for all of us who have been engaged in this kind of research, because it doesn't make total sense when you're trained as a qualitative researcher, and when all of a sudden you're living in quantitative research land. And so one of the things that we actually worked with our colleagues in political science and peace and conflict studies was to actually figure out how we could collect data in an anthropological way that was amenable to the Uppsala Conflict Data Series data set, which is sort of the international gold standard for conflict studies. So that if this project is able to evolve beyond just a test case in Syria and Iraq, it could actually be used in parallel and in tandem with this other conflict data. And so that means, yes, actually collecting information about who the initiator is of the action. One of the things that we also found that we did not expect when we started looking at these events was the number of people who were dying trying to protect the heritage site, or who were caught up in the collateral damage of the destruction of that heritage site. That was totally unexpected to us. And so what we found is we had to actually pause and go back and actually try and actually determine body counts, look at the literature of people who study how you determine the number of people killed in a conflict incident, to capture that same level of information. And so, I mean, I think that the goal here is precisely as you were saying. How do you create that context of data collection so that it has the kind of cultural information that we feel comfortable with as anthropologists, but at the same time we can actually convince our colleagues in these other social scientists that, you know, there really is a there here, whether it's with religious heritage, whether it's other kinds of cultural sites, that's being ignored in the way that conflict is studied right now in these other fields. And I think that that's a contribution that anthropology can really make here.
Any other comments or questions?
Hi. Oh, that's loud. Hi, sorry. I'm Celia Tuckman-Rasta, and I'm actually doing research on intangible cultural heritage and reconstruction of classical Cambodian dance. So I appreciated, Corey Wegner, how you brought in intangible heritage project that you're working on, and also Brian Daniels, how you talked about maybe archaeology kind of being overemphasized sometimes in terms of heritage preservation. I'm interested in how the destruction of intangible cultural heritage might kind of be looked at or approached in these kinds of ways. And maybe your thoughts on whether making a distinction between cultural heritage and intangible cultural heritage limits the way we're thinking about violence against different communities.
Hi, thanks for your question. I'll just make a couple comments about one of the challenges has been that so far in international humanitarian law, the 1954 Hague Convention deals with cultural property and it doesn't address intangible cultural heritage. I think that's one of the challenges, and we've taken, the US took decades to address just the cultural property. And so, but I think most would agree with you that, you know, it's a continuum, actually, and there shouldn't be such a division. But I think that's one of the challenges, is that we actually have treaty law to present in that aspect when we're talking about armed conflicts and training militaries, et cetera. But I'll also say that obviously it's, you know, I think Brian and I agree on this, and we've talked about it along the way, is that you can't separate what people are doing today. It's continuing on. So, right, that you have these communities who continue to engage with that cultural heritage, whether they see it as theirs. So, for instance, like in Iraq, when the Iraq National Museum was looted in 2003, I think a lot of people had separated themselves from the contents of that building. They saw it as a private collection of the regime, et cetera, and didn't really see it as connected to them today and what their daily activities were in Baghdad. But, and I think that's the challenge we all face. I'm an art historian and museum professional, and so how to connect people with a heritage where they may not realize the connections anymore. But how we deal with this, with like refugee populations and being able to help people stay connected to a heritage that's been completely destroyed, and how do you do that? This is going to be an ongoing challenge, and I'm happy that there are groups out there that are trying to do this work, and this is, you know, one small part of what we're trying to do with SHOSI.
I think that the only other piece that I would add to what Corey just said, I mean, really, I come to a lot of this work personally through the work that I've done for the past 17 years with Native American communities who have suffered often from their own genocide experience and the forced effort to assimilate them and to really end Native American culture. Something I know that Joe, you know, has experienced acutely, but can comment more on than I can. But oftentimes what I found myself thinking about with SHOSI, and what I found myself thinking about intellectually, is that you're talking about the moment where you know you may be having to deal with cultural revitalization down the line, 50, 100 years in the future. And I oftentimes think, I mean, you're talking, Celia, about trying to reconstruct Cambodian traditional dance, right? And so, I mean, there's a reason why that's gone. And so as a practitioner here, right, if we turn to the applied anthropology of this, it seems to me that one of the questions is, okay, if you're in that moment, right, and you're in the moment where the genocide is happening, you're in the moment when violent death is happening, you know intellectually that there's going to be that moment of revitalization. What do you want? What is that community going to want? And what can you do as an anthropologist to really fill that moment? And I think that's oftentimes what I try and grapple with on this issue.
We have time for one more comment or question, if there is one.
This is just a quick question. I'm Kathy Cameron from University of Colorado. I wondered if it seems to me that I became really aware of the destruction of cultural heritage in 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq, and that was, you know, just a horrible moment around the world. Everyone was appalled. And now it seems that we're hearing more and more about what's people are trying to take these incidents and, you know, learn about them and you know, catalog what's happening. Does it feel like we're getting better at that? I know I edit a journal, and we've got a paper using aerial photographs to catalog destruction in Tunisia and determine what's happened there. Does it feel like we're getting more of a handle on that so that when the next conflict comes along, we'll be in a better position to deal with it? Or not, I guess.
Corey, do you want to take a gander at that? I mean, I think we could go down the line here. I know that it depends which side of the bed I wake up on, to be honest with you. There's some days where I feel quite optimistic, especially with efforts like what Corey leads, the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. I mean, really trying to figure out ways to step into that breach. And the First Aid for Culture program that she leads, training there that Reem spoke about. And there are days when I utterly and completely despair. And I think that has much to do with international politics. That has much to do with the vagaries of figuring out funding, not so much on the research, but on how you actually deal with moving small amounts of money to communities who desperately need it in the middle of a conflict zone to be able to do some good. I mean, these are logistically complicated things. Structurally, I mean, maybe I'm in the despair mood right now, but structurally we're not there yet internationally, I don't think. And one of the things I think I heard everybody saying today is that, we need to give more thought to this.
Just very quick, I don't think we're going to be in better shape. What I do hope we will be is aware that we can do more than simply say this is bad and go close our doors to our offices. We can actually, and I think this is where what Corey and Brian and many others are doing, is that they are working with people, even within conflict zones, working with local communities and people on the ground who are desperate to save their own heritage and are aware of this, but they need help and resources because they're in the middle of a conflict zone. And I think we can actually step up and say we can do more. It's not the big stuff. We're not going to suddenly try to get rid of ISIS. I mean, getting rid of ISIS is either Obama or perhaps Trump's problem now. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen there, but it is really, and we've talked about this at Penn, it's small stories. But I think we can do a lot more and be prepared for those types of stories and those types of activities rather than simply say, it's beyond our abilities, we can't do anything. And I think for me, if that's the lesson we can take away, that means a lot, because it's supporting people who are trying to resist on the ground and trying to think about their future, not as purely where does my next food come from, which is critical, but also how do we come out of this conflict as Syrians, as Maya, as somebody with an identity that's tied to this cultural heritage. Thank you. Reem, do you want to say anything? One last thing?
I just wanted to comment on the intangible heritage thing, because it is also, and actually I was thinking of including it in the discussion today, but I had very short time. So intangible heritage, it is one of the aspects that Syrians are really calling to consider in the projects, and you can see lots of initiatives on community level, like now, for example, I know some people that are working on collecting, like we have a lot of sayings, like common sayings in our language, and they're working on collecting this. We have also, in Aleppo, for example, we have the cuisine of Aleppo, and this is why I stressed on the food aspect when I was talking, because the cuisine of Aleppo is very also essential for the people. So also people now trying to collect recipes and to make, and you have lots of Facebook pages about it. So on the local level, people are really fighting for their intangible heritage, and especially to make it as like a reference for children who are now growing in far places, like in Europe or in camps or something, so that they kind of create for them references when they grow up to find, to connect to their intangible heritage. So I wanted to say this.
It is 3:30.
Because I forgot to write this down earlier, how can people find out more about the Conflict Culture Research Network?
You can find more information about the network at conflictculture.info or on Facebook at Conflict Culture.
Thank you all very much for coming.